times they are not forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. And where I was born, maybe on a road tomorrow. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. I wish I was in Dixie, hooray, hooray. In Dixieland, I'd take my stand and live and die in Dixie. Away, away, away down south in Dixie, away. Folks, the reality is, I do not wish I was Dixie. In fact, there's no place I'd rather be right now than in front of my computer screen talking to you about the politics and economics of the Civil War, Part 3 here. You know what that means, folks. Forget about those Southerners. Forget about Dixie. Alrighty? We'd rather be in Cali covering us some bomb A-push note action. Let's go right to slide 50 here, folks, because that's where we are going to begin today. Alrighty? And of course, what that means is we are, of course, going to be beginning on slide 50 of Civil War and Politics. Alrighty, we're starting with the armies. Well, how were they raised? How were they created? Because hey, this is a war on a massive scale. We've never fought a war like this before. The armies in the Civil War are 10 times larger in many instances than the armies during the Revolution or War of 1812. This was mass war, alrighty? So how did we get to this point? Remember, originally Lincoln called for volunteers, so did the South, alrighty? Eventually, both nations are going to go to a draft. Let's go to the North first. Again, originally an all-volunteer army up until the middle portion of the war, but in 1863, for the very first time, the federal conscription draft happened. We had a draft. Another word for draft is conscription, where you're conscripted into the army whether you wanted to be or not. Anyways, there were less volunteers by this point. They needed more troops. They went to a draft. Now, here was one of the unfair parts about it. If you were wealthy, you could actually buy a replacement. You could pay to have yourself replaced by someone who could not afford to. The cost was $300. So therefore, those that were wealthier generally did not have to serve unless they chose to. The draft was absolutely hated in many northern cities, especially where Irish immigrants were strong. Look, remember, the Irish and free blacks had historically had rivalries, conflict, violence, riots. Now what the government is doing is, hey, you have to serve in the army, Irish immigrants, whether you supported slavery or not. So after the Emancipation Proclamation, as we get later into the war, when they went in, they forced Irish immigrants to serve. Sometimes there were riots. The most famous was the New York Draft Riot. It lasted for days and days. In New York, 500 people died over this, rioting between the Irish immigrants and the authorities trying to stop it. Alrighty? Anyways, while volunteerism in the army was one thing, many folks were opposed to being forced to serve, especially in those large cities where immigrants dominated. Alrighty? But there were rewards for joining. You got bounties, they were called, which was essentially a reward, a signing bonus as well. Alrighty? Ultimately, there were deserters in both armies, alrighty, in both North and South, especially as the war drags on. During tough times, more and more likely folks would desert, alrighty. Interestingly enough, in an effort to try to prevent these desertions, people leaving, people running away, there were some instances where the armies actually killed their own soldiers who had left, who had run away, to try to send a message to others not to retreat, okay? The South, too, relied on volunteers originally. They had a much smaller population. That meant they had to go to conscription. They had to go to a draft much earlier, over a year earlier. And their draft included every man between the ages of 17 and 50. That shows you how desperate the South was getting by 1862 as their numbers started to reduce. Also, rich men could hire substitutes as well. Alrighty, they could hire substitutes. They could purchase somebody to, fill their spot. Many Mountain Whites refused to join still. In fact, many of those guys, if you recall, end up joining the Union. Alrighty, we're going to jump ahead to slide 56. Hey, the North is going to use African American soldiers. Now, more and more as the war goes on, they're going to rely more on black soldiers, partly because volunteerism starts to be reduced. Alrighty, there were about 10% of all Union troops by the end of the war. Many fought, many died. Most of them did come from slave states, but some were Northerners who were free. Originally, black volunteers were rejected by the North, by the Northern Army. That all changed later on when as there was more and more of a need, more and more of a demand for them. Originally, there were some whites who were afraid, kind of worried about arming blacks, but ultimately the North did so anyways. Of course, the need was a primary reason. Alrighty. Lincoln believed strongly in the black regiments. He thought that they were key to the victory. If anybody's ever seen the amazing movie Glory, and by the way, we watched that after the AP test, it does an amazing job of depicting the role, the responsibility these folks had in helping to win the war effort. All right, not often glorified, not often received a lot of support, didn't receive a lot of national applause, but these folks fought alongside whites and did a very, very strong job. Alrighty, we're going to move ahead to slide 58. There you can see an advertisement for for an all black regiment. They were known as colored regiments. Please note at the bottom, one of the ways to get guys to sign up, if you can see, they got a letter from Charles Sumner. We remember Sumner. He, of course, was the guy that was caned by Preston Brooks in Congress during the Bleeding Kansas issue. Anyways, folks, let's move ahead to slide 60. Alrighty. The Confederacy didn't really enlist slaves until like the last months of the war. Alrighty, when they got supremely desperate, the South actually started signing slaves up the last month or two. They basically promised them their freedom. Up until then, slaves were forced to work in labor battalions. They dug trenches, ditches. They built, fortifications. They would bring water and supplies maybe between battle lines. Things along those lines. Alrighty, they get desperate at the end. They actually armed some of their slaves, promised them freedom. Native Americans usually sided with the South. Alrighty, their enemy was the United States government. It had been since Americans had really arrived. Most Native Americans served with the Confederacy, including most of the 5 civilized tribes. They believed it was the best way for them to maybe hold on to their what land they actually retained. And remember, some of those 5 civilized tribes were actually slave owners themselves. That being said, we did have troops, Indian Native American troops, that did fight for both sides, although more were fought for the South. Alrighty, Civil War economics. Again, economics really is going to help the North to win the war. Alrighty, and so we got to spend a little bit of time on that. Hey, the North is really going to pay for the war as it's going on. One, they're going to implement an income tax. It's temporary. Alrighty, it's a very small tax, but it's going to be repealed after the war. But they taxed every person's income. A small percentage was taken out. That helped to fund the war effort. Alrighty. Also, excise taxes. We remember those. Sin taxes, we sometimes call them, on unnecessary goods, on wants, not on needs. Tobacco, alcohol were both taxed at higher levels during the war to help, again, fund the war effort. This was the big one, though, on slide 63. It was a moral tariff. We raised the tariff rate about 10%. We raised up the Walker tariff that had been signed under James Polk. We raised those rates for protection, but also for extra revenue. Alrighty, the revenue was needed to fund the war. The protection was a boost to the Union economy and to the industry. From this point forward, honestly, for about 75 more years after this, the Republicans are always associated with the tariff. They always wanted higher tariffs. After all, they're more of a party of the North. Alrighty, they did sell some war bonds, some IOUs to the public, where the public gave them money. The government promised to pay them back later on. Also, finally, folks, we're going to institute a banking system. We hadn't had a national banking system since the decline of the Second Bank of the U.S., and it was a huge drain. It was a huge problem during the war. And so we're going to create something called, well, the national banking system. We passed the National Banking Act, and it is exactly what it sounds like. It establishes a national banking system where we're going to have banks, head banks, key banks at various major cities around the country. Alrighty, they were the ones that printed all money in this country. Our first national currency that was printed, all right, that was universally accepted across all of the states of the nation, was called the greenback. Ultimately, again, they're going to stabilize the currency. They're going to help to stabilize the economic system, make it more smooth. Those are the original greenbacks, by the way. Who's on them? Solomon Chase and Abe Lincoln. That shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. The presidents, the politicians who were in charge at the time were the ones who were placed on the bills. Basically, what would happen is other banks would basically join the national banking system, alrighty, and that meant that they could buy bonds, they could issue paper money through the federal government, alrighty. Again, this was the first national bank since Jackson had killed the Bank of the U.S., and it's a huge success. The Northern economy roars during the war. It actually comes out in many ways stronger after the war than when it started. And these policies, the tariff, the national banking system, are huge. They're key, alrighty, in re-energizing the American economy and leading us into a second period of industrialization after the war. Meanwhile, compare that to the South. The South was a disaster, alrighty. They lost almost all of their customs duties. They lost all of their tariff money, alrighty, because, well, they weren't able to export their goods anymore, so they couldn't get payment for them. They lost all their tariff money because, well, they're not part of the U.S. They don't believe in the tariff. Alrighty. They sold bonds to citizens. Citizens gave them money in exchange for paper IOUs. They'll pay them later. Alright. They did increase taxes. Eventually, guys, when they get desperate and they have no other solution, all the Southerners did is they just printed a ton of paper money, and we know what happens when you do that. Temporarily, maybe for a couple of months, you might have enough paper money to pay off your debts, but eventually the prices start to go way up because there's way too much paper money being used. It devalues your money, it raises prices up artificially. The government printed $1 billion in paper money during this time without coming up any other way to raise income. Inflation, along with the taxes that were raised, destroyed the Southern economy. Prices got to be so high that the paper money was worthless. Alrighty, you continuously had to pay more. One week you would spend, as much as $100 on a loaf of bread. The next week it would be $1,000. Every single day that you went on, that the inflation went up, your money became less and less valuable. Alrighty, same problem we're going to see in the Weimar Republic after World War I. Look, you never should just print paper money as a solution to your problems. All that does is it triggers inflation. Alrighty, out of control inflation, runaway inflation. Slide 69. Meanwhile, in the North, again, the North prospers. It prospers in some ways largely because of the war. We have our first group of millionaires that emerge. These are the factory owners, these industrialists. They're benefited by the tariff. Many of them supplied war industries. We have all of these new machines that are going to be developed. Some of them developed during the war or to help support the war, like the sewing machine. Alrighty, mechanical reapers go way up as well as the war goes on. The oil industry starts. It's called petroleum. If you're not aware of that, it's first discovered. Discovered in Pennsylvania, and that's going to become more and more important. We're going to need petroleum for lighting. For heating purposes. A lot of folks used kerosene, which is a light oil that comes actually from petroleum. Okay? So all of these are reasons why the North economy booms. Also, we have incredible westward expansion during the war. Remember, the Republicans wanted a Homestead Act. They passed it. It gave free lands to pioneers who were willing to settle out west. Basically, what they said is, hey, if you're willing to go out west, into these tougher areas where it's tough to grow crops, if you'll settle there, if you'll try to farm that area and make it successful, we'll give you the land for free. Alrighty, 20,000 settlers are going to head out during the last year of the war. There's going to be a massive flood of settlers after the war, white and black. Many veterans are going to try to take advantage of this Homestead Act as well. It's going to encourage massive movement out west. Alrighty, also, you had those gold seekers. There's a gold rush in California in the late 1840s. There's going to be a gold rush in Nevada during the 1850s. You have folks who are racing out west to settle, like homesteaders, to make a fortune, like gold and silver miners, and this process is going to really increase after the war. Alrighty, that's because on slide 73 we're going to be talking about the Pacific Railway Act. This is the act, the law, that leads to the development, the building of the first transcontinental railroad. Before the war, remember, there was discussion about building a southern railroad. Well, once the war started, that plan stopped, obviously. And so instead, what the North decided to do is go ahead with their plan to build that railroad. Alrighty. Of course, it's going to run through northern states, just like Stephen Douglas had always envisioned. It's going to kind of start in Illinois and connect from Illinois to all the way to California. Alrighty. The railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad, is probably the most important development in the entire Industrial Revolution. It completely changes American society. It's going to lead to the development of the steel industry, the ranching and economy, the mining industry, huge agriculture farms and ranches out west. It completely revolutionizes our economy when we developed this Transcontinental Railroad, and it occurred because of the Pacific Railway Act, where we finally decided once and for all we're building that railroad. It gets built 7 years later. It's completed in 1869. Alrighty. Really, yeah. Well, one of the only industries to suffer during the war was shipping. And that was because of those commerce raiders. Anyways, again, slide 74 really kind of spells it out for you. Whigs and their plans that turned into Republican platform or Republican plans. And as you can see, higher tariff, moral tariff, transcontinental railroad, a Homestead Act, a banking system, a land grant act that we're going to get into later on as well, which encouraged even more settlement out west. The federal government gave huge grants of land to states to encourage settlement. And of course, the abolition of slavery down the road. Alrighty, there's our memory device for the Republican policies during the Civil War. Yep, AP history makes me nauseous. Alrighty, well, it doesn't me, but it might sometimes you. Demise of the Cotton Kingdom. Let's move to slide 76. We're going to wrap it up here. The Union blockade was devastating to the South. Alrighty, the South could not get any war materials in once the blockade was sealed, about midway point of the war in about 1863. They could not get cotton out. Alrighty, the Southern economy was destroyed. The rail system was destroyed. Cotton was captured and burned, or provided to the North or to England. The South never industrialized, while the North continues to do so. They didn't have the railroad. They didn't have the weapons. They didn't have the ammunition. They simply didn't have the industry. Okay. Slide 77, and this is where we wrap it up, folks. Look, you need to understand one thing. In order to win the war, Abraham Lincoln is technically going to ignore parts of the Constitution. In fact, to be honest with you, there was no president in our history who probably ignored parts of the Constitution more than Lincoln. Now, his attitude was, hey, I'm going to take away certain rights, certain liberties that the people are guaranteed, because this is a crazy time. It's an extreme time. It's a time of war. Desperate times call for desperate measures by the president. As soon as the war is over, Lincoln says, I'm going to get rid of these rules. I'm going to go back to honoring the Constitution again. He argues that it's such an extreme threat to the nation during this time that there should be special powers given to the president to help win the war. And he does honor these promises. After the war, he's going to get rid of all of these suspension of rights and liberties that Americans had. Let's go through them real quickly. He wants to save the Union. Again, he believed that there were a number of Americans that were against the country, and they were doing everything they could to defeat us during the war. We're going to move to slide 78. First off, the blockade. It was called the Anaconda Plan. All right, the blockade to defeat the South. He technically did it without the support of Congress. He can do that short-term, temporarily, but eventually Congress has to support. Ultimately, later on, both Congress and the Supreme Court agreed with Lincoln and supported the blockade. He increased the size of the Federal Army and Navy. He didn't have congressional authority to do so. But ultimately, again, later on, Congress technically agrees with him and sides with him. Alrighty. Remember, he extended the volunteer period from 3 months to 3 years. Technically, only Congress can do that. He did it on his own anyways. Guys, he gave $2 million of government money to 3 individuals, private citizens, who then went and bought military goods. Alrighty, he did all this privately. Alright, he gave this money, or he had this money given to these guys so they could buy the military weapons, the hardware to help win the war. Technically, he never told Congress about it. Again, that's a violation of the rules. Alrighty, probably his most famous actions were he suspended habeas corpus. Remember, habeas corpus is the rule that says you have to be brought up. There's a reason you have to be brought up on charges by the government. He would hold anti-unionists. He would hold Confederate supporters, Southern sympathizers, in jail without bringing up charges against them. In some instances, he did it for months or years. Eventually, the Supreme Court actually ruled in a case that's called Ex parte Merryman, Lincoln, you can't do this, alrighty? You don't have the power to do it, alrighty? Lincoln ignored it, just like Jackson had done before, and continued to hold these guys in jail without any charges, simply because he believed they were against the war effort, and if he let them out, they would do everything they could to help the South, alrighty? Congress later on approved his actions. Alrighty, we did arrest a lot of people for espionage, for smuggling, as well. He had the Union Army actually oversee voting in the border states. What I mean there is when people in the border states voted, there were 2 colored ballots. One indicated you voted for Democrat, one for the Republican. And literally, when these people had to go and vote, they had to walk past Union troops who were there to intimidate them to vote for the Northern candidates. Alrighty. Slide 82. Federal officials were sometimes suspended or arresting for obstructing a war or criticizing the war effort. Slide 83. Again, only a handful of folks were arrested, but needless to say, he did ignore the Constitution in doing that. Alrighty. Ultimately, Jefferson Davis never had those powers during the Civil War. Folks, the Civil War is a modern war. It's a total war. Civilians are going to become targets. The economies are going to switch over. Everything about the war